Hello there, welcome to Nighttime Stories. I hope you've had a wonderful day. Now it's time to unwind. I'm here to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Before you get cozy, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more bedtime stories your way. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. I'm not easily frightened. In fact, if you were to ask anyone who knows me, they'd tell you I'm the last person to flinch at strange noises in the night. I've spent years camping alone in remote areas across the country. No one who's ever traveled as much as I have would bat an eye at a few rustling leaves or the distant call of an animal. But the night I spent in Rabbit Valley changed everything. It was a quiet evening. Too quiet, maybe. I'd been driving for hours, crossing the border between Colorado and Utah, and I needed to rest. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a place far enough from the highway to sleep without the hum of cars or the glare of streetlights. Rabbit Valley seemed like the perfect spot. It was desolate, surrounded by nothing but wide open space and rugged terrain. I'd heard about it from other campers as a peaceful, remote site, ideal for solitude. So, I parked my truck at one of the isolated campsites, which were at least 15 to 20 miles from the nearest road. There was only one other rig in the area, and they were far off in the distance. I didn't mind. It was peaceful. It was quiet. I set up my teepee-style tent, a new purchase off of Amazon. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep me sheltered from the elements. The air was cold, crisp, and still, just the way I liked it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I got settled in, ready to drift off. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the serene quiet, but it didn't last long. I woke to an odd sound, something faint but persistent. It started out as a scraping noise, almost like someone dragging their fingers across the nylon of my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, a light, deliberate sound, like someone was walking around my tent, running their fingers along the edges of the fabric. Slowly, methodically, back and forth, I lay perfectly still, holding my breath. I couldn't see anything outside my tent. There were no animals, nothing that could explain it. My heart began to race. It was as if someone was walking in a slow circle around my tent, deliberately making sure I could hear every scrape of their fingers. The sound was eerily rhythmic, like they had all the time in the world. Minutes dragged on. Maybe it was only 5 minutes. Maybe it was 15. It felt like an eternity. I tried to steady my breath to remain calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The scraping continued, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, my mind racing. Every inch of me screamed to act, to do something, but I didn't. I stayed there silent, listening. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, some animal brushing up against the tent, but something inside me knew better. Another 15 minutes passed. The silence now felt suffocating. Then, without warning, it happened. My tent, the one I'd just pitched with such care, suddenly caved in. The center pole collapsed, and the entire structure folded inward, trapping me inside. I had a brief moment of disorientation, and I realized the only thing holding the tent at an angle was a small support beam that had somehow managed to stay intact. My heart was hammering in my chest as I ripped open the zipper of my tent. I didn't think, I just acted. I bolted out of the tent and ran for my truck. I crawled into the bed, locked the topper from the inside, and grabbed my firearm. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the grip, but I didn't feel safe enough to sleep. I stayed wide awake the entire night, waiting for daylight. The darkness outside seemed to close in on me, as if something were waiting for me to fall asleep. When the sun finally rose, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things and went straight back to the campsite. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it just my nerves? Was I imagining it? But deep down I knew I wasn't. Something was off, very off. I went to inspect the area, hoping to find some sign that would explain it away. Maybe it was a bear or a large animal that brushed up against the tent. I could feel the unease growing in the pit of my stomach, but I pressed on, and that's when I saw them. Around my tent, in the cold desert dirt and snow, there were shoe prints. They weren't mine. I recognized my own tracks, leading to and from the campsite, but these were different. They were made by boots with pointed toes, deep imprints in the ground. The pattern they made was unmistakable. It was clear that someone had walked around my tent. Not just once, but multiple times. The prints were in a circle, as though someone had been pacing around me while I was inside. There were no other tracks, just these circular prints, making a steady loop around my tent, as if whoever it was had been studying me, waiting, watching. I felt a chill run down my spine, and that's when it hit me. They had known I was inside. They knew I was alone. They had been waiting for me to make a move. And the sound I'd heard, the scraping, it wasn't a random animal, it was deliberate. Someone had been touching the fabric of my tent. Someone had been taunting me. I looked further into the valley, hoping for an explanation. But the tracks, those boots, had wandered off into the wilderness, leading further into the desolate land. There were no signs of any other campsites, no vehicles in sight. Just an empty, barren landscape stretching out before me. Whoever had been there wasn't coming back, but I didn't stick around to see if they would. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before. I threw my things into my truck, locked the doors, and drove off without a second thought. I didn't even care about the rest of the day's drive. All I cared about was getting out of there. I didn't look back. To this day, I haven't been back to Rabbit Valley, and I don't think I ever will. Even now, every time I go camping, every time I set up a tent and sit beneath the stars, I can't shake that feeling. The feeling of someone watching, someone waiting just beyond the edge of the firelight. And every time the wind picks up and I hear a scrape on the side of my tent, I remember those boot prints. I remember the circle they made around me. I remember the eerie silence of that night. I don't know who or what was out there in the valley. I don't know if they were real or if it was all in my head. But I do know this. I'll never forget the sound of someone scraping their fingers across the side of my tent. I don't scare easily, never have. Growing up in a rough neighborhood and working in high-stress environments has made me thick-skinned and level-headed. I'm the kind of person who hears a strange noise at night and assumes it's the wind, or a raccoon, at worst. Monsters don't exist, and ghost stories are just that, stories. At least that's what I've always told myself. But I can't explain what happened to me that night. I had heard of skinwalkers before. The name alone is enough to send shivers down your spine. According to legend, they're shapeshifters, beings that can take on the form of animals or even humans. Some say they're witches cursed by dark rituals. Others say they're ancient spirits feeding on fear. They mimic voices calling for help in tones that sound human but lack emotion, luring unsuspecting victims closer. I always brushed it off as folklore, just stories told to scare people from venturing too far into the wilderness. I never gave it much thought until I found myself in a situation that made me wonder if those stories were more than just tales. Life had been weighing on me. Work had become a relentless grind. Family tensions were at an all-time high, and even my friends seemed to drain me. I needed a break, somewhere to clear my head. That's how I found myself packing for a solo camping trip. No one to bother me, no deadlines, no expectations, just me, the trees, and the quiet. The drive to the campsite was long, winding through forested roads that seemed to stretch on forever. I decided on a secluded spot, miles away from any trailheads or public camping areas. I wanted solitude, and I got it. By the time I arrived at the trailhead and started hiking, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool, the kind that bites just enough to remind you you're alive. As I made my way deeper into the woods, something caught my eye. A deer stood motionless a few yards off the trail, staring directly at me. Its body was perfectly still, too still, as though it were frozen in time. Its eyes were unnerving, not soft and curious like most deer, but sharp and focused. It felt like it was studying me. I kept walking, brushing it off as my imagination. But then there was another one. A second deer stood farther ahead, staring in the same unsettling way, and another. Each one seemed to appear out of nowhere, their heads turning slowly to watch me as I passed. They didn't move toward me, but they didn't move away either. It was as though they were trapped in some sort of trance, and for a moment I felt like I was too. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the spell broke. The deer shook their heads, snorted, and bounded off into the woods like nothing had happened. I told myself it was just a coincidence, but unease crept in like a shadow I couldn't shake. Something was off. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it in my gut. About halfway to my chosen campsite, I saw a man wandering through the trees. He was swaying slightly, his movements uneven, like he might be drunk. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans, and his head was down, his face obscured. I thought about saying something, a quick, "Hey, you good?" But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he moved, slow and erratic, like he wasn't fully aware of his surroundings. Or maybe it was the strange sensation that washed over me, a feeling like I shouldn't draw attention to myself. He didn't seem to notice me, and I passed him without incident. I told myself he was just a guy enjoying the woods in his own way. But deep down, I knew better. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun had almost set. I pitched my tent, built a small fire, and tried to relax. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. But that stillness didn't bring peace. It felt oppressive, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something. I was starting to feel a little better when I heard it. "Help! Help me!" It was a man's voice, distant but clear. The words carried through the trees, echoing faintly. At first, I thought someone might actually be in trouble. I stood straining to listen. "Help me! Over here!" The voice came again, but this time, something about it felt wrong. The tone was too flat, too monotone, like someone mimicking a call for help rather than genuinely needing it. It lacked urgency. "Help me," the voice repeated, almost like a recording. The same inflection, the same rhythm, over and over. It was closer now, but I couldn't see anyone. My skin crawled. I wanted to call out, to ask if they were okay, but something in the back of my mind screamed, "Don't." I sat back down by the fire, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The voice kept calling, circling my campsite. It would fade into the distance, then grow louder again, moving in an erratic pattern. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, my heart pounding. I felt like I was being watched. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent my heart racing. I stayed in my tent, clutching a knife, waiting for something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste a second. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started back toward my truck. As I passed the spot where I'd seen the man the day before, I noticed something on the ground. Footprints. But they weren't normal footprints. They were barefoot, long and narrow, with claw-like impressions at the tips of the toes. They led off the trail and disappeared into the dense woods. I didn't stick around to investigate. I made it back to my truck, locked the doors, and drove until I was miles away from that forest. To this day, I still don't know who or what I encountered out there. Was it just a drunken man lost in the woods, or something far darker? A skinwalker, perhaps, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. I'll never be sure. There were 5 of us, 5 friends who had once been inseparable, but over the years had drifted apart, each of us pulled in different directions by work, relationships, or just life in general. The plan seemed simple enough. A weekend camping trip in an isolated forest, far from everything, no phones, no distractions, just the fire, the stars, and the hope of reconnecting. It was Ethan who brought it up first. Ethan, the one who used to be the glue that held us all together. He'd been the one to organize our little gatherings in the past, even when it seemed like no one else could be bothered. This time, though, it was different. His message in the group chat was casual, almost nostalgic. How about we do something crazy? Go camping. We all need a break. At first it seemed like a bad idea, but then we all agreed. The thought of getting away from the noise of daily life was appealing, even if the idea of spending a weekend in the middle of nowhere made me uneasy. There was Jamie, always the practical one, the one who kept track of everyone's schedules and made sure things got done. She had been Ethan's best friend since childhood, and even though they'd grown apart over the years, I could tell that he still held a special place in her life. When she agreed to the trip, I figured it was because she needed a break just as much as the rest of us. Her job had been stressing her out, and her recent breakup hadn't helped. She seemed eager to get away from everything. Then there was Tom. He was the jokester, the one who could lighten any mood. Tom always had something sarcastic to say, always made everyone laugh. I used to love how he could always crack a joke even in the most awkward situations. But lately, I noticed that even his jokes seemed hollow, like he was trying too hard to keep the group's energy up. He had just started a new job, and I could tell he was struggling. He didn't say much about it, but the trip seemed like his way of trying to reset. Sarah was the quiet one. She never said much, but she always noticed everything. She was the observer of the group, the one who seemed to see things we didn't. I'd always admired her sensitivity, but I could never tell if it was a gift or a curse. She hadn't been in touch much over the past few months, but I was glad to hear that she was coming along. I guess we all had our reasons for wanting to leave the world behind, even if none of us spoke them aloud. And then there was Ryan. Ryan was the one who never really fit in, the one who always seemed off. He wasn't the type to open up, even though we had known him for years. There was always something about him, something cold and detached. He'd been part of our group since high school, but even then, I could never put my finger on what it was about him that made me uneasy. He was quiet, so quiet that sometimes I forgot he was even there. And yet, every now and then, when he did speak, it felt like he was saying something just a little too strange, too calculated. When he said he was coming along, I was surprised, but I didn't think much of it. After all, it had been years since we all hung out together. Maybe this was his way of reconnecting. I should have paid more attention to that feeling, the one I'd always had, the nagging feeling that something was off about Ryan. But at the time, it didn't seem important. And so, we went. The forest was more isolated than I had imagined. Ethan drove us out there in his old rusted truck, winding down narrow gravel roads that seemed to vanish into the trees. The further we went, the more I began to feel a creeping sense of isolation. I could see it in Sarah's face, too. She stared out the window, her eyes wide, but she didn't say anything. Jamie, of course, was in charge of everything. She pulled out maps, made sure we had enough supplies, and started organizing the campsite with military precision. She always had a way of taking control, and I couldn't help but feel a little relieved that she was here. It was easy to let her do the heavy lifting while I watched. Tom, on the other hand, was goofing around, trying to get everyone to play a ridiculous game of charades while we set up the tents. His voice echoed through the trees, breaking the silence in a way that made me shiver slightly. It was as if the forest didn't like being disturbed. Ryan was just, there. He hadn't said much since we arrived. He barely even glanced at the campsite. He was standing a few yards away, leaning against a tree, looking off into the distance. He had a strange intensity about him, something that made me wonder if he was really present or if his mind was somewhere else entirely. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid. Ryan had always been like this, quiet, distant. Maybe that was just who he was. But I couldn't ignore the prickling on the back of my neck. Something was wrong. By the time night fell, the forest felt even more suffocating. We had gathered around the campfire, its flickering light casting strange shadows on our faces. The air was still, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Jamie had started talking about her job, venting about the stress and the pressure she'd been under. I could tell she was trying to let it all out, to feel like herself again. Tom was laughing and throwing in jokes, trying to keep the mood light. But for some reason, I couldn't fully engage. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Ryan hadn't said a word all evening. He just stared at the fire, his face illuminated by the orange glow. Every now and then, he would shift his gaze to one of us, but it wasn't the kind of look that felt reassuring. It was more like he was analyzing us, studying us. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice quieter than usual. "There's something strange about this place. It feels like we're being watched." Her words sent a ripple through the group, and I could see the unease in everyone's eyes. Even Tom stopped laughing for a moment. "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan said, trying to brush it off. "We're just here to relax. There's nothing out here but trees." But Sarah's words had struck a chord with me. I'd been thinking the same thing. Ryan turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Sarah. His eyes didn't have the warmth I remembered from our childhood. They were cold, calculating. I couldn't explain it, but in that moment I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're right," Ryan said softly. "We're being watched." As the fire crackled, a sudden gust of wind swept through the camp, sending a few of the logs tumbling. We all jumped, but it wasn't just the wind that startled me. For a brief moment, just as the flames flickered out, I could have sworn I saw a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the tree line. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it was tall and seemed to move unnaturally, as though it wasn't quite right. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "What?" Jamie asked, looking up from her phone, which she'd finally pulled out to check the time. "I thought I saw someone in the trees," I replied, my voice low. "Probably just an animal," she said, dismissing it with a laugh, but there was an edge to her voice. I could tell she didn't like the way the atmosphere had shifted either. Tom looked over at Ryan. "What about you, man? See anything?" Ryan didn't answer. He just stared into the darkness, his expression unreadable. "I think we should go to bed," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. Jamie nodded, standing up. "Yeah, good idea. We'll get an early start tomorrow." Ryan stood too, though he didn't seem eager to leave the fire's warmth. "Do you think it'll come for us?" he asked, his voice soft and strange. "Come for us?" Tom echoed, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "What are you talking about, man?" Ryan didn't answer. He just kept staring at the darkness. As I lay in my tent that night, the sound of the wind outside was the only thing that kept me from spiraling into full-blown panic. But even that sound was different. Distant, almost hollow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept thinking about Ryan. Something was wrong with him. It wasn't just the way he had acted tonight. It was the way he had been acting for months now, whenever we all got together. He didn't seem like the same person I once knew. I heard something move outside the tent, just a rustle of leaves. I held my breath, waiting, but it was probably just an animal. Still, my heart pounded in my chest, and sleep refused to come. The next morning, the tension hadn't lifted. If anything, it was worse. Jamie tried to keep things moving, suggesting a hike to get everyone's mind off the unease, but I could tell no one was fully into it. Tom tried to joke his way through the hike, but his jokes seemed forced now. Even Sarah was quiet, her eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out from behind the trees. Ryan, of course, was quiet again. More than usual. He barely spoke at all as we hiked deeper into the forest. The air felt thick, like something was watching us from the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all just waiting for something. I don't know why I decided to wander off. Maybe it was the silence getting to me, or maybe it was just the need to escape the group. But I stepped off the trail, just for a minute, to take a breath away from the others. That's when I found it. Buried beneath some leaves was an old tattered journal. It was leather-bound, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. I picked it up, dusted it off, and opened the first page. It was written in a careful, precise hand, the words almost too neat to be real, but the deeper I read, the more the words began to twist into something darker. It was filled with descriptions, observations, about us. We had gathered around the campfire, its flickering light casting strange shadows on our faces. The air was still, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Jamie had started talking about her job, venting about the stress and the pressure she'd been under. I could tell she was trying to let it all out, to feel like herself again. Tom was laughing and throwing in jokes, trying to keep the mood light. But for some reason, I couldn't fully engage. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Ryan hadn't said a word all evening. He just stared at the fire, his face illuminated by the orange glow. Every now and then, he would shift his gaze to one of us, but it wasn't the kind of look that felt reassuring. It was more like he was analyzing us, studying us. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice quieter than usual. "There's something strange about this place. It feels like we're being watched." Her words sent a ripple through the group, and I could see the unease in everyone's eyes. Even Tom stopped laughing for a moment. "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan said, trying to brush it off. "We're just here to relax. There's nothing out here but trees." But Sarah's words had struck a chord with me. I'd been thinking the same thing. Ryan turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Sarah. His eyes didn't have the warmth I remembered from our childhood. They were cold, calculating. I couldn't explain it, but in that moment I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're right," Ryan said softly. "We're being watched." As the fire crackled, a sudden gust of wind swept through the camp, sending a few of the logs tumbling. We all jumped, but it wasn't just the wind that startled me. For a brief moment, just as the flames flickered out, I could have sworn I saw a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the tree line. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it was tall and seemed to move unnaturally, as though it wasn't quite right. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "What?" Jamie asked, looking up from her phone, which she'd finally pulled out to check the time. "I thought I saw someone in the trees," I replied, my voice low. "Probably just an animal," she said, dismissing it with a laugh, but there was an edge to her voice. I could tell she didn't like the way the atmosphere had shifted either. Tom looked over at Ryan. "What about you, man? See anything?" Ryan didn't answer. He just stared into the darkness, his expression unreadable. "I think we should go to bed," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. Jamie nodded, standing up. "Yeah, good idea. We'll get an early start tomorrow." Ryan stood too, though he didn't seem eager to leave the fire's warmth. "Do you think it'll come for us?" he asked, his voice soft and strange. "Come for us?" Tom echoed, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "What are you talking about, man?" Ryan didn't answer. He just kept staring at the darkness. As I lay in my tent that night, the sound of the wind outside was the only thing that kept me from spiraling into full-blown panic. But even that sound was different. Distant, almost hollow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept thinking about Ryan. Something was wrong with him. It wasn't just the way he had acted tonight. It was the way he had been acting for months now, whenever we all got together. He didn't seem like the same person I once knew. I heard something move outside the tent, just a rustle of leaves. I held my breath, waiting, but it was probably just an animal. Still, my heart pounded in my chest, and sleep refused to come. The next morning, the tension hadn't lifted. If anything, it was worse. Jamie tried to keep things moving, suggesting a hike to get everyone's mind off the unease, but I could tell no one was fully into it. Tom tried to joke his way through the hike, but his jokes seemed forced now. Even Sarah was quiet, her eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out from behind the trees. Ryan, of course, was quiet again. More than usual. He barely spoke at all as we hiked deeper into the forest. The air felt thick, like something was watching us from the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all just waiting for something. I don't know why I decided to wander off. Maybe it was the silence getting to me, Or maybe it was just the need to escape the group. But I stepped off the trail, just for a minute, to take a breath away from the others. That's when I found it. Buried beneath some leaves was an old tattered journal. It was leather-bound, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. I picked it up, dusted it off, and opened the first page. It was written in a careful, precise hand, the words almost too neat to be real, but the deeper I read, the more the words began to twist into something darker. It was filled with descriptions, observations, about us. Tom slammed on the gas and we sped off into the forest, the tires screeching as we tore down the narrow path. We didn't look back. I couldn't. The only thing that mattered was getting away. We made it. Somehow, we made it. We found service far enough down the road, and I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the campsite was empty. Ryan was gone. No trace of him. No evidence of what had happened. Nothing but the ashes of the fire we'd left behind. The police questioned us, but we didn't know what to tell them. How do you explain what we'd seen? How do you tell them about the man who was never really a man? The monster who had been walking among us for years. When they left, we drove back to the city in silence. I could feel the weight of the journal in my bag, but I didn't want to open it again. Not now, not ever. We were safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was still out there, waiting, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Because in the end, I realized something. He had always been in control. He had always been one step ahead of us. And now, I couldn't help but wonder, had we really escaped? Or had he just let us go? I don't scare easily. That's something I've always prided myself on, working night shifts at an old office building. Most people would have quit after the first week. But I stuck with it. It's quiet, almost peaceful. The world outside goes to sleep, and I'm left to monitor empty floors and make sure everything is running smoothly. There's a strange comfort in that. No distractions, no interruptions, just me, the security cameras, and the soft hum of the building's old machinery. At first the building seemed harmless enough, a relic from another era, old and worn down, but nothing that screamed danger. Most of the tenants had moved out years ago, leaving the space almost entirely empty. Just me and a few cleaning staff wandering the halls, but something about the silence in that place felt off. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd find in a peaceful home. It was deeper, unsettling, as though the building itself was waiting for something, or someone. It didn't take long before the odd occurrences started. Small things at first, flickering lights, a strange creak in the floorboards. I tried to brush them off, convinced it was just the building settling. But then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping that echoed through the halls. It wasn't loud enough to be a knock, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked the floors, checking every room, but found nothing. The tapping continued, always in the background, like a faint drumbeat. For a while, I told myself it was just the pipes or the wind, but as the weeks passed, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound wasn't random. It seemed to come from a specific spot each night, a corner of the building where the lights always flickered. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the more I listened, the more the tapping felt deliberate. Someone or something was out there, and it was waiting for me to notice. One night, I decided to do something about it. I'd had enough of the tapping and the strange feeling that followed me through the halls. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, I set out to investigate the building's dark corners. The lights in the hallway flickered as I passed each room. The silence felt like a weight pressing down on me. But I kept moving. The tapping was louder now, closer. It wasn't just the pipes or the wind. There was something in the building with me. I made my way to the back of the floor, to a storage room I'd never paid much attention to. As I opened the door, the temperature dropped. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. The room was empty, but the air felt thick, as though it was holding something back. I turned the flashlight on, scanning the room. That's when I saw it. a shadow, just barely moving in the corner of the room. I froze. It was like something had been waiting for me. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went through my routine as usual, checking the security footage, but nothing seemed out of place. No sign of the shadow I had seen. No evidence that anything had been there. I wondered if it was all just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The building had a strange presence to it, something that made the air feel heavy. I wasn't alone there. Not really. Later that night, the whispers started. At first, it was a faint rustling, like a distant conversation. I thought I was hearing things, but as the hours passed, the whispers grew louder. It was as if the voices were coming from every direction, surrounding me. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was the wind or maybe even my tired mind playing tricks on me. But it didn't stop. I felt a cold presence behind me, a chill that wasn't from the building's draft. I wasn't just hearing things. Something was there with me. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the shadows. Something in the building had changed, and it was slowly driving me to the edge. I started to question my sanity. Was I losing it? Was this all in my head? I didn't know. I thought maybe I was just stressed. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me. But every night it was the same. The whispers, the tapping, the figure I couldn't quite see but could always feel. It was getting harder to ignore. That's when I received the letter from HR. It was brief, but it sent a shiver down my spine. They wanted to meet with me, to discuss something important. I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd been doing my job as usual, but the tone of the letter felt off, like they knew something I didn't. I was uneasy, but I had to go. Whatever was happening in that building, I needed answers. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. When I arrived at HR's office the next evening, the atmosphere was tense. The room was dimly lit, and the woman sitting across from me didn't say a word as I took a seat. She just stared at me, her expression unreadable. There was an uncomfortable silence before she slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a printout of a security camera feed from the night before. The footage showed me walking down the hallway, just as I had done so countless times. But something was different this time. In the background of the footage there was a figure. It was standing still, almost hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out the details, but I knew something wasn't right. I hadn't seen anyone else in the building that night, and yet there it was. The figure, watching me. The woman in HR didn't speak for a moment, letting the weight of the footage sink in. I tried to explain myself. "It must be a glitch," I said, trying to rationalize it. "Maybe someone's messing with the security system." But HR wasn't buying it. They were asking questions I didn't have answers to. Was I hearing things? Was I seeing things that weren't there? They asked me about my well-being, about how long I'd been working the night shifts. I could tell they were concerned, but I wasn't sure if it was because of the footage or because they thought I was losing my mind. The more I thought about it, the more the doubt crept in. Could this all be in my head? Was I imagining things? I didn't know anymore. The shadow, the whispers, the figure on the footage. It all felt too real to be a trick of the mind. But then again, I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to believe I was losing touch with reality. I wanted to believe that there was something, someone else in that building, something I could confront. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the building was playing tricks on me. After the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that HR was trying to get rid of me. They didn't say it outright, but there was an underlying implication that I wasn't cut out for the job anymore. The building was getting to me, they suggested. Maybe I needed some time off, some rest. But I couldn't rest. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen and heard. The shadows, the figure on the footage. And the more I thought about it, the more the whispers came back. Louder, clearer. I wasn't imagining it. Something was happening in that building. Something I wasn't ready to understand. That night, I decided I would face it head on. I couldn't keep running from whatever was in that building. I had to confront it, whatever it was. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my determination, I ventured deep into the building's lower floors. The lights flickered as I moved down the long hallway, the whispers growing louder, almost in time with my heartbeat. The tapping started again, faster this time, as if it was counting down to something. I reached the maintenance room, the one I had avoided for weeks, the one where I had first seen the shadow. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it was colder than I remembered, colder than it should have been. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old machinery, but there was something more, a sense of presence. I stepped inside and called out, my voice trembling slightly in the silence. No response. But then, I heard something. A voice. Faint, but unmistakable. I stood in the maintenance room, flashlight in hand, scanning the dusty shelves and worn-down equipment. The whispers had stopped for a moment, and I took the opportunity to steady my nerves. I couldn't let this building, whatever was going on, break me. I'd been through far worse, I told myself. But then, something happened. As I turned to leave, I saw a face in the reflection of the window behind me, someone staring back at me from within the glass. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty room. I shook my head, feeling a sudden wave of dizziness. I wasn't sure if it was the lack of sleep or something more sinister. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door handle. The room felt colder than before, and the silence felt like it was suffocating me. I stepped back into the hallway, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The lights flickered again, and I thought I saw a figure at the end of the corridor, a tall, thin man with a dark coat. I blinked, and he was gone. I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of it, but the world around me seemed to blur, everything twisting and shifting like a bad dream. The next day, everything felt off. I woke up late, my alarm having failed to go off. I was disoriented, like I had just woken up from a deep sleep, although I couldn't remember falling asleep. The room was unfamiliar, and for a moment, I thought I was in a different place altogether. Then I remembered I was at home. It was a strange feeling, like the lines between my reality and the world around me were starting to blur. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was losing my grip on something, but I didn't know what. I called my friend Jake, someone I used to hang out with before all this. He was one of the few people I still kept in touch with. But when he picked up, his voice sounded distant, as if he were speaking from a faraway place. "Hey, Alex," he said, his voice low. "How's work?" I could hear the concern in his tone, but I didn't know why. "It's fine," I replied, even though I didn't feel fine. "I've just been a little off lately." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Maybe you need to take a break, man. You've been working those night shifts too long. You're not yourself." I agreed, but the truth was I couldn't explain why I didn't feel like myself. The world around me seemed more distant than usual, like I was watching it through a fogged-up window. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't make sense of. I kept seeing flashes of faces in the dark, and the whispers had returned, not just in the building, but in my apartment too. They murmured my name, taunted me, asking if I was ready to face the truth. What truth? I didn't know. Every time I tried to sleep, I would jerk awake, convinced that I had heard someone in the next room. I would get up to check, only to find that there was no one there. But the unsettling feeling lingered. My apartment was empty, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like something was watching me. I tried to reach out to Jake again, but this time he didn't pick up. I left him a message, but my fingers trembled as I typed. I couldn't seem to keep them steady. The next morning, I got a text from him. "Hey man, I think you should go see someone. This isn't normal. I'm worried." It stung, but I knew he was right. Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. But I didn't know who to talk to. Who would believe me? Who would understand what was happening to me? The line between reality and delusion had become too thin, and I was afraid of crossing it completely. That night I saw it again. The figure, the tall man in the dark coat. Only this time he was standing at the end of my bed, just beyond the foot of it. I could see his face, pale, gaunt, his eyes hollow and unblinking. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on him, unable to look away. The room was silent, save for the pounding of my heart in my ears. But when I blinked, he was gone, just like before. I sat up in bed, gasping for air, my palms sweating. I had to be dreaming. I had to be. But the cold chill in the room told me otherwise. I grabbed my phone and dialed Jake's number again, but it went straight to voicemail. I didn't know what to do anymore. The building was worse than I had realized. But it wasn't just the building. It was me. The figure. The whispers. The strange feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't real, but it was. It was real in my mind. I had spent so many nights in the dark, alone with my thoughts, that I'd lost touch with reality. I'd started to hear things, see things that weren't there. I had no idea how long it had been happening, but now I understood I'd been in this place for too long. It wasn't just the building that was broken, it was me. I reached out to Jake once more, but this time something was different. His voice was softer, distant, like he was saying it from far away. "Alex," he said, "I think it's time you went to see someone. I don't know how to help you anymore." I didn't want to hear it, but deep down I knew it was true. I had to face the truth. But the truth was something I wasn't ready to accept. The shadows had already taken root in my mind, and I was losing the battle. The next few days were a blur. I wasn't sure if I was sleeping or awake anymore. I would wake up in strange places, on the couch, in the kitchen, without remembering how I had gotten there. The voices wouldn't stop. They were louder now, filling my mind with thoughts I didn't recognize. Sometimes I would hear someone knocking at my door, but when I opened it, no one would be there. I started seeing figures in the corner of my vision, shadows that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, just my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew the truth. Something had broken inside me, and I didn't know how to fix it. I decided to go back to the office to see if maybe, just maybe, I could make sense of what was happening. But as I walked through the hallways, everything felt different. The building seemed alive in a way it hadn't before. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The whispers were louder than ever, and the figure was there, standing in the shadows, waiting. I tried to approach it, but my body wouldn't move. I was trapped in my own mind, unable to escape the reality I had built for myself. And then I realized with a cold chill that I wasn't trapped in the building at all. I was trapped inside my own mind. The walls of the office felt like they were closing in around me. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, flickering with every step I took. I couldn't tell what was real anymore, the whispers, the tapping, the figure. It all felt so vivid, like a sick game that the building had been playing with me. I had convinced myself that there was something, someone, stalking me. Something supernatural that had been following me for months, maybe even years. I had become obsessed with the idea, searching for clues, trying to find the one thing that could explain it all. But the harder I searched, the more it felt like I was spiraling into madness. I don't know what led me to the doctor's office that day, or how I even managed to get myself there. But something inside me knew I needed help. My mind was unraveling, and I couldn't fix it on my own. The diagnosis came quickly: schizophrenia. The words felt foreign, unreal, as though they belonged to someone else. But as the doctor explained, everything began to make sense. The voices I'd been hearing, the shadows in the corners of my vision, the figure I'd seen in the maintenance room. It wasn't a stalker, it wasn't a ghost. It was me, my mind betraying me. The doctor spoke in a calm, reassuring voice. "Schizophrenia is a chronic condition. It causes people to experience hallucinations, things that aren't really there, sounds that aren't real. It's not uncommon for those with schizophrenia to feel as though they're being watched, or even followed by unseen forces. I was in shock. I wanted to deny it. But deep down, I knew it was true. Everything I had experienced, everything that had plagued me for months, was a result of my mind, my fractured mind, playing tricks on me. It wasn't a ghost and it wasn't a stalker. It was a part of me, something I couldn't control. I had always prided myself on being strong, on not letting fear take hold. But now, I saw the truth. I had been fighting an enemy within myself, and I had lost. The doctor suggested therapy, medication, and taking time off work. But the idea of stopping, of confronting the reality of what was happening to me, terrified me. How had I gotten here? How had I ended up in this place where I couldn't trust my own senses? I kept thinking back to my childhood, trying to remember if there had been signs earlier on. Had something happened back then? I couldn't pinpoint it, but there were fragments of memories, strange flashes of my younger self, moments when I'd felt disconnected from reality, when I'd seen things that weren't there, heard voices that no one else could hear. I thought it was just imagination, just a phase that I would grow out of, but I hadn't. The doctor asked me about my family history. I didn't have much to go on. My parents weren't really involved in my life, and I never knew much about their past. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. When I was young, I'd been in a car accident. It wasn't a major one, but I had hit my head pretty hard. The doctors had said it was just a concussion, that there was no lasting damage. But what if that was the trigger? What if that moment, that injury, had set something off in my brain? It was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that could explain the gradual descent into madness that I had experienced over the years. I walked out of the doctor's office in a daze. The weight of the diagnosis hung heavy on my chest, and the streets felt strange beneath my feet. The world looked different now, like a distorted reflection in a broken mirror. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure of what would happen if I took another step. I wanted to go back to my apartment, to curl up in bed, and pretend like none of this was real. But I knew I couldn't. I had to face it. I had to face myself. As the days went by, the hallucinations didn't stop. But now, I understood what they were. I understood that the figure in the dark coat, the tapping, the whispers, none of it had been real. It had all been a manifestation of my mind, a product of my illness. I tried to accept it, tried to make peace with it, but it wasn't easy. I had spent so long convincing myself that something supernatural was happening to me, that I had been stalked or haunted by some unseen force. It was easier to believe in ghosts than in the terrifying reality that I was the one who had been chasing shadows all along. A few weeks later, I received a call from HR. They had heard about my diagnosis, and while they expressed concern, they offered me the opportunity to take a leave of absence. It was clear they didn't want to fire me, but they also didn't know how to handle the situation. I appreciated their offer, but I knew it was time for me to leave for good. I couldn't stay in that building, in that city, any longer. The place that had once felt so familiar had become a prison for my mind, a place where I had been trapped by my own delusions. I packed up my things and left without a word. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want to face the reality of what I had become. But as I drove away, I knew it was the right decision. I couldn't keep running from the truth. It wasn't a supernatural force that had been watching me. It wasn't some dark entity following my every move. It was me all along. And the hardest part was realizing that the only way to escape was to confront the very thing I had been trying to outrun, myself. I moved here 2 weeks ago. A fresh start, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. The old apartment, the one I had lived in for years, had become suffocating. A reminder of things I wanted to forget. This house, with its fresh wooden floors and the scent of new paint still clinging to the walls, was supposed to be a reset, a blank slate. Something about the stillness of an empty home had always appealed to me, the way it sat in quiet anticipation of the life that would fill it. I spent the first few days scrubbing every inch, not because it was dirty, but because the act of cleaning made it feel more like mine. The house was older, but it had charm. High ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and large windows that let in too much light during the day. At night, though, the glass turned into black mirrors, reflecting only the dim glow of the streetlights outside. The air smelled of sawdust and varnish, a reminder that the renovations had only just been completed before I moved in. Everything felt crisp, new. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe again. But it didn't take long before things started to feel off. It was small things at first. The back door, which I was sure I had locked, would be slightly ajar in the mornings. A window I had left open to let in the evening breeze would be shut tight when I woke up. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness. Moving was exhausting, and my mind had been cluttered with 1,000 little tasks. Maybe I had locked the back door. Maybe I had closed the window before bed and simply forgotten. Then the noises started. It wasn't the usual sounds of an old house settling, those random pops and creaks that could be explained away by temperature changes. No, these were different. Rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps, faint but distinct, echoing down the hallway in the dead of night. The first time I heard them, I sat up in bed, heart hammering, straining to listen. A part of me wanted to believe I had imagined it, that the silence of the house was playing tricks on me. But as I held my breath, the sound came again. Slow, measured steps, moving toward my bedroom door. I had to remind myself that I was alone. There was no one else here. Still, I got up and checked, stepping cautiously into the hallway. The floorboards cold beneath my bare feet. The house was empty, just as I had left it. I turned on every light, checked the locks, even opened the closets, though I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Nothing. Just silence. But the feeling of being watched lingered, thick and suffocating. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained. I must have tossed and turned for hours after hearing those footsteps, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe the stress of the move was getting to me. I forced myself to shake it off. The house felt different in the daylight, safer. The hardwood floors gleamed under the sun, the fresh paint smelled reassuring, and for a moment I felt foolish for letting my imagination run wild the night before. I made coffee, stood by the window, and watched the neighborhood wake up. The street was quiet, mostly older houses with well-kept lawns and neatly trimmed hedges, the kind of place that should feel safe. I kept busy that day, unpacking the last of my boxes, hanging up pictures, and rearranging furniture until everything felt just right. But as I moved around the house, a thought lingered in the back of my mind. Had the air always felt this thick? Heavy, almost like I was moving through something unseen. I shook the thought away and kept myself distracted. That night, it happened again. I woke up abruptly, unsure why, my skin clammy with sweat. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then I noticed the door. I always slept with it closed. I was sure of it. But now it was open, just a crack. A slow, creeping unease curled around my spine. I sat up, staring at the sliver of darkness beyond the doorway. I wanted to tell myself that I had simply forgotten, that I'd left it open by mistake, but I knew better. Pushing back the covers, I slid out of bed, each step toward the door feeling heavier than the last. I placed my hand against the wood and pushed it open, peering into the hallway. Empty. The dim light from the street lamp outside barely reached the corners of the corridor, leaving long shadows stretching across the floor. I checked the locks again, my pulse quickening when I found the front door unlocked. My stomach twisted. I had locked it, I was sure of it. But the deadbolt was undone, the door slightly ajar. I stood there listening. Nothing. Just silence. Swallowing hard, I locked it again, double-checking this time. Then, feeling foolish, I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little better. Back in bed, I tried to sleep, but every creak of the house had me on edge. I kept my eyes on the doorway, waiting, though I didn't know for what. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted into uneasy sleep. The next few days, the strange occurrences continued. The doors I locked at night would be open in the morning. My keys would disappear, only to turn up in places I was certain I hadn't left them. The lights in the hallway flickered, even though the bulbs were brand new. And then the worst of it. One night, as I passed by the hallway mirror, I thought I saw something. A figure, just behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. Nothing was there. The hallway was empty, but my reflection, my own face, stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. I barely slept that night. By the second week, I'd started keeping a knife on my nightstand. I told myself it was ridiculous, that I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this house. Then, one night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't ignore. A slow, deliberate knock, not at the front door, from inside the house. I froze. The knock came again, 3 steady taps against wood. It was close. Too close. Then I realized it was coming from inside my closet. I held my breath, every muscle in my body going rigid. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. My mind raced with explanations, but none of them made sense. I reached for the knife, gripping the handle so tightly my knuckles turned white, and then slowly the closet door began to creak open. The closet door creaked open just an inch, but that was enough to make my stomach drop. The darkness inside was absolute, so black it felt unnatural, as if the space inside was swallowing all the light. I gripped the knife tighter, my breath shallow and uneven. I told myself to move, to get up, to do something, but I couldn't. I just stared, frozen in place, waiting for something to happen. Seconds passed, then a minute. Nothing. I forced myself to stand, legs unsteady beneath me. Slowly, cautiously, I reached for the lamp on my nightstand and flicked it on. Light flooded the room, chasing away the shadows. The closet was empty. My heart slammed against my ribs as I hesitated. Then, gripping the knife, I took a step forward. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door and pulled it open all the way. Nothing. Just my clothes, hanging neatly on their hangers. My boxes stacked in the corner. The silence in the room was thick, pressing down on me like a weight. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "You're losing it," I muttered under my breath. But as I turned back toward my bed, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The chair, the one I had wedged under the front door handle just hours ago. It was back in its place at the dining table. The next morning, I called a locksmith. I didn't care how crazy I sounded. I told him my locks weren't working properly, that my front door seemed to be unlocking itself in the middle of the night. The man, an older guy with rough hands and a cigarette tucked behind his ear, gave me a skeptical look, but replaced the entire lock anyway. "Doubt anyone's getting through that now," he said, testing it. "You're all set." I thanked him, watching as he packed up his tools and left. I waited until his truck disappeared down the street before turning back to the door, testing the lock myself. It felt solid, secure. For the first time in days, I felt like I had some control again, but that night, I woke up to something far worse, not footsteps, not knocking, breathing. It was soft, just above a whisper, but it was there, and it was right next to me. My entire body stiffened. I lay frozen in bed, too afraid to turn my head. The sound was steady, inhale, exhale, deep and slow, like someone was lying right beside me. The knife was still on my nightstand. I knew it was within reach, but I was too scared to move. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, barely daring to blink. Eventually, exhaustion won. When I opened my eyes again, the sun was peeking through the blinds and the house was silent. For a split second, I convinced myself I had imagined it, that it had been nothing but a dream. And then I saw the imprint, the deep, unmistakable indentation on the mattress beside me, as if someone had been lying there, watching me. I didn't sleep the next night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the imprint beside me, the weight of something unseen pressing into the mattress. I tried convincing myself it was nothing, that maybe I had shifted in my sleep, but I knew better. Something was in this house with me. I spent the entire day searching for an explanation. I checked the security footage from the small camera I'd installed outside my front door a few days ago. I was half expecting to see something, anything on the recordings, a shadow, a figure, movement. But there was nothing, not even me. The footage from the past 2 nights was blank. Not corrupted, not static. Just completely empty, as if I had never stepped outside, as if I hadn't even existed. I stared at the screen, a cold shiver running through me. What the hell was happening? That night, I barricaded the door to my bedroom. Not just the front door. I wasn't taking chances anymore. I dragged my dresser in front of the door, placed the chair under the handle, and even wedged a heavy box in the corner. I double-checked the windows, making sure they were locked. Then, gripping the knife, I sat on the edge of my bed and waited. The house was silent. Too silent. Every muscle in my body was tense, listening for the smallest sound. Hours passed. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but I refused to sleep. Then, at 3:12 a.m., something knocked. Not on the front door. Not from inside the closet. From the other side of the bedroom door. I stopped breathing. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. I clutched the knife so hard my fingers ached. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Then, just as I was about to stand, something else happened. The doorknob turned, not violently. Not like someone was trying to break in. It was slow, careful, testing. The dresser against the door didn't budge, but I could hear the subtle shift of the wood, the slight strain of pressure against the frame. I forced myself to move, to stand up. Every part of me screamed to stay still, to pretend I hadn't noticed. Then, in the silence, something whispered my name, a soft, rasping voice. So close to the door it sent a wave of cold terror down my spine. And then, a loud bang. The door shook violently, as if something had slammed against it with full force. The whole room trembled, and then nothing. Silence. For minutes I stood there, gripping the knife, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't dare move. I waited, and waited. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I reached for my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed. 911. What's your emergency? I swallowed hard. Someone's in my house. The dispatcher's voice was calm, too calm. You said someone is inside your house, I forced myself to whisper. Yes, they tried to get into my room. Are you in a safe place? I swallowed hard, glancing at the door. The dresser was still in place, unmoved. I think so. Stay on the line with me. Officers are on their way. I barely heard her. My focus was on the door. I strained to listen, but the house was deathly silent. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. The police arrived 13 minutes later. It felt like an eternity. I heard the distant wail of sirens, followed by the unmistakable thud, thud, thud of heavy boots approaching my front door. Then, bang, bang, bang. Police, open up. I scrambled to move the dresser, nearly dropping the knife in my panic. My fingers fumbled with the locks, and when I finally yanked the door open, 2 officers stood there, hands resting near their holsters. Their eyes scanned me quickly. Barefoot, shirt damp with sweat, shaking like a leaf. One of them, a stocky man with sharp eyes, spoke first. You called in a break-in? I nodded frantically. Someone was inside. They tried to open my bedroom door. The second officer, taller and younger, exchanged a glance with his partner. "Did you see anyone?" I hesitated. "No." "Did you hear them leave?" I shook my head. Stocky officer pulled out a flashlight. "Stay here. We'll clear the house." I stood frozen in the hallway as they moved through the rooms, checking every closet, every corner, every possible hiding spot. My heart slammed against my ribs with each passing second. I kept expecting to hear shouting, a scuffle, something. But after 10 minutes they returned. Tall officer shook his head. "No signs of forced entry. Everything's locked." Stocky officer crossed his arms. "Nothing's missing. No sign that anyone's been inside." I stared at them. But I heard it. The knocking. The door handle moving. Stocky officer's expression was unreadable. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" My stomach twisted. No, I was awake. I was awake." Neither of them looked convinced. "You live alone?" I nodded. They exchanged another glance before Stocky officer sighed. "Look, we'll file a report, but there's nothing else we can do tonight. If you see anything, real anything, call us again." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. They left a few minutes later, their car's red and blue lights flickering against my windows as they pulled away. And just like that, I was alone again. But as I shut the door, a realization settled deep in my gut. They were wrong. Someone had been inside, and they still were. I didn't sleep that night. Even after the police left, my mind kept replaying the sound of the knocking, the slow turn of the doorknob. They hadn't found anything. But that didn't mean nothing had happened. I checked every lock in the house again, tested the windows, even wedged the chair back under the front door handle. Then, gripping the knife, I sat on the couch with my back to the wall, waiting for something to happen again. But the night passed in silence. No knocks, no creaking floors, nothing. By the time the sun crept through the blinds, exhaustion weighed me down like bricks. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the police were right. Maybe I had imagined it. Half awake in the dark, my mind playing tricks on me. And yet, something still felt off. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't focus. Instead, I forced myself to do something that should have been obvious from the beginning. I started looking into the house's history. Real estate records were easy enough to find online. The house had been built in the late 80s, sold a few times over the years, nothing unusual. But then I dug deeper. The owner before me, a man named Daniel M., had lived here for over 15 years. He'd sold the house suddenly. No records of a job transfer, no marriage or divorce, nothing that explained why he would leave a house he had owned for so long. Then I found an old news article, a short piece buried in the archives of the local paper. "Local man found squatting in foreclosed home." My chest tightened as I read. A man, unnamed in the article, had been found living inside the walls of a foreclosed house. The new owners had discovered makeshift bedding and food scraps hidden in the attic and crawl spaces. By the time police arrived, he was gone. There was no record of him being caught. I stared at the screen, my breath coming faster. The house in the article wasn't mine, but it was 3 blocks away. Suddenly the strange things I had brushed off, the doors unlocking, the objects moving, didn't seem so small anymore. I felt sick. Someone had been in my house, and they might still be here. I called the police again. The dispatcher sounded irritated, like she recognized my number. "Sir, you reported this last night. Officers searched the home." "They didn't check the walls," I cut in. My voice shook. "The crawl spaces, the attic. What if someone's been hiding inside?" A long silence. Then, "We'll send someone over." This time I wasn't waiting inside. I stood on the curb, watching as 2 different officers arrived. They were younger, skeptical, but I showed them the article. I told them I heard movement at night, that things weren't where I left them. The taller officer sighed. "All right, we'll take a look." The The search took longer this time. They knocked against the walls, listening for anything hollow. Checked inside every vent, every crawl space. One of them pulled down the attic ladder and climbed up, sweeping his flashlight into the darkness. I stood in the hallway, heart pounding. Then, Jesus Christ, the officer's voice echoed down from above. I gripped the railing. What? What is it? A pause. Then, his voice lower, you might want to see this. I climbed up, my stomach twisting. The attic was dark, dust swirling in the beam of the flashlight. The officer stood in the corner, pointing at something. A mattress, old filthy, covered in flattened blankets, a few empty water bottles, food wrappers, and a notebook. I picked it up, my hands clammy as I flipped through the pages. Most of it was nonsense. Scribbled words, strange symbols. But then, on one of the last pages, I saw something that made my blood run cold. He doesn't know I watch him sleep. I dropped the notebook like it burned me. My skin crawled. Whoever had been staying here had been watching me. The officer muttered a curse under his breath. We'll dust for prints, check security cams in the area. But if this guy's been living here, he's long gone now. I barely heard him, because something was scratching at the back of my brain, something I hadn't let myself consider until now. What if he wasn't just living here? What if he never actually left? The police left after taking photos and dusting for prints. They told me they'd keep an eye on things, but I could tell they weren't convinced this guy would come back. I wasn't so sure. I sat on the couch staring at the front door, every nerve in my body on edge. The notebook was still on the kitchen counter, its pages filled with erratic scribbles. I hadn't touched it since I dropped it, but one sentence kept repeating in my head. He doesn't know I watch him sleep. How many nights had I been completely unaware? How many times had I woken up, stretched, yawned, without realizing someone was inches away just out of sight? I shivered. It was over now. The police had been through every inch of the house. They found his hideout. He was gone. I was safe. I kept telling myself that. But deep down I didn't believe it. That night I set up my phone to record while I slept. I needed proof. Needed to know if I was just being paranoid or if something was still wrong. I placed it on my nightstand, camera facing my bed, and hit record. Then I wedged a chair under the door handle again, double-checked every lock, and crawled under the blankets. For the first time in days, I fell into an exhausted sleep. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check my phone. My stomach tightened as I opened the video. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Just me, shifting slightly in my sleep. The room was dimly lit by the glow of the street lamp outside, shadows stretching along the walls. Then at 3:47 a.m. I saw it. The closet door. Slowly, silently, it crept open. An inch. Then another. I bolted upright, heart hammering in my chest. My hands shook as I scrubbed back through the footage, staring at the screen in horror. The door had been closed when I went to sleep, I was sure of it. But now, it was open. Wide open. I hadn't imagined it. He was still here. I didn't call the police this time. I couldn't. What would I even tell them? That my closet door moved? That I felt like I wasn't alone? They already thought I was losing it. I needed proof. I spent the whole day on edge, jumping at every sound. I knew he was watching me. Knew he was waiting for something, so I made a plan. That night I locked up as usual. I put the chair under the doorknob. I set up my phone to record again. But this time, I didn't go to sleep. I waited. The house was silent. For hours I lay in bed, barely blinking, staring at the closet door. My phone was recording, its tiny red light barely visible in the dark. At 3:51 a.m., the air changed. It was subtle, just a slight shift, like the room had become denser, heavier, and then movement. The closet door creaked. Just a fraction. I stayed completely still. My breathing was shallow, controlled. Every muscle in my body tensed as I gripped the knife under my pillow. Then a shadow. Slow, deliberate. just barely visible in the darkness. He was inside, watching me, waiting. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I forced myself to stay calm. Not yet. If I moved too soon, he'd run. And I needed to end this. Then finally, a footstep, software careful, he was coming closer. I moved fast. In one motion, I grabbed my phone, flicked on the flashlight, and lunged. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure inches from my bed. A man. Thin, unkempt. His clothes tattered, his skin pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His eyes, wild, empty. For a split second, we locked eyes. Then, he bolted. I chased him, nearly tripping over the blankets. He knew the house better than me. Dove into the hallway, moving fast, too fast. By the time I reached the front door, it was wide open, and he was gone. The police took me seriously after that. I had video proof, a grainy, shaky recording of a man stepping out of my closet. They searched the house again, found where he had cut into the wall behind the closet, creating a space just big enough to squeeze through. That was how he'd been moving around without me noticing. That was how he'd been watching me. The officers told me he was probably the previous owner. Maybe he had lost the house but never really left. Maybe he felt like it was still his. Whatever the case, he was still out there. They never found him, but I wasn't going to wait around. The next morning, I packed a bag. I didn't bother selling the place. I just left. Because no matter how many locks I changed, no matter how many times the police searched, one fact would always remain. He knew how to get in. And next time, I might not wake up. I had never spent a night alone before. Not completely alone. Sure, my parents had left me home while they ran errands or went out to dinner. But this was different. This was 3 whole nights by myself. I was 13 at the time, old enough to stay home without a babysitter, but still young enough that the idea of being alone for that long made me uneasy. I didn't tell my parents that, though. I wanted to prove I could handle it. They were going out of town for a wedding. One of my dad's old college friends was getting married in another state. They'd booked a hotel, packed their bags, and told me I was responsible enough to stay home this time. "You'll be fine," Mom had said, kissing the top of my head before leaving. "You're mature for your age. Just call us if you need anything." I had nodded, forcing a smile. I didn't want them to think I was nervous, but I was. Not because I was scared of the dark or sleeping alone, but because something about the house felt different without them. Too quiet, too empty. The first night was fine. I ordered pizza, played video games, and kept all the lights on like some little kid afraid of monsters. By midnight, I'd convinced myself I was being stupid. It was just a house, my house, the same one I'd lived in my whole life. Nothing had changed. At least that's what I thought. But when I woke up the next morning, the back door was unlocked. At first, I told myself I had just forgotten to lock the door. Maybe I had gone out back the night before and didn't remember. Maybe I hadn't pulled the handle hard enough, and the wind had pushed it open a little. That had to be it. Still, I felt uneasy as I locked it again, double-checking it this time. Something about waking up to an unlocked door just felt wrong. That day dragged by slowly. I spent most of it watching TV, trying to keep myself distracted. But every so often, my mind would wander back to the door. Had it really been me? Or had someone else, something else, been in the house? By the time the sun set, I was exhausted from overthinking. I decided to call it an early night, but as I was brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, a memory crept back into my mind. Something I hadn't thought about until now. I had seen a man outside a few nights before my parents left. I had been taking the trash out when I saw him. It was late, probably around 10 p.m., and the neighborhood was quiet. Our street wasn't busy at night, just a row of houses with long driveways and darkened windows. As I dragged the trash bin to the curb, I spotted him standing at the corner. A man. Too far away to see clearly, but something about him made me pause. He wasn't walking like a normal person heading somewhere. He was just standing there, still, watching. I remembered feeling uneasy, but I'd shaken it off. Just some guy out for a walk. But then the next night, he was there again. Same spot, same stillness. I had only glanced at him that time, hurrying back inside. Told myself I was imagining things, and then just like that, I had forgotten about him. Until now. Until I woke up in an empty house and found the back door unlocked. I stood in the bathroom, toothbrush still in my mouth, staring at my own reflection. The more I thought about it, the more I knew that man hadn't just been some random person. He had been watching. And now, with my parents gone and me here alone, something didn't feel right. I tried to shake it off, rinsing my mouth and turning off the light. Just my imagination. That's all. I was psyching myself out. But as I walked down the hall toward my bedroom, my foot squelched against the tile. I froze. Slowly, I looked down. A wet footprint. Right in the middle of the hallway. I swallowed hard. Maybe I had spilled something earlier. Maybe I had walked inside with wet shoes and didn't realize it. But then I saw another. And another. A trail of damp, muddy footprints leading from the back door, which I had locked this morning, through the kitchen and into the living room. My stomach twisted. I followed them carefully, my breathing shallow. The prints were spaced apart heel to toe, like someone had walked through my house, barefoot, leaving a silent trail behind. I reached the living room and stopped. The footprints ended at the couch, like someone had stood there, watching, and then what? Where did they go? My skin prickled. I turned slowly, scanning the dimly lit room. The windows were locked. The front door was shut. No other footprints leading away. Whoever left them never left. I was still not alone. My throat felt tight. I turned in slow circles, scanning every dark corner of the living room. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. The back door was locked. The windows were shut. There were no footprints leading away. So where did they go? A sharp creak echoed through the house. I spun around. The sound had come from down the hall, near my bedroom. My entire body tensed. I forced myself to breathe slowly, my ears straining for any other noise. Silence. But I knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone was in here with me. I moved carefully, gripping my phone so hard my fingers ached. Call someone. That thought pounded in my head, but my body refused to listen. Instead, I followed the footprints back toward the hallway, stepping as lightly as I could. My bedroom door was slightly ajar. It had been closed before. A single sliver of darkness stretched across the floor, leading into my room. My stomach twisted. I reached out and pushed the door open all the way. The room was empty, or at least it looked that way. I took a shaky breath, scanning every inch of the space. My bed was unmade, the blanket slightly pulled back from where I had slept the night before. My closet was shut. The desk chair was exactly where I left it. But then, the closet door moved, just an inch. Not enough to be the wind, not enough to be an accident. Someone was in there, hiding, watching me. I felt something cold creep up my spine. I could run. I could turn and bolt out of the house, sprint to a neighbor's door, or call the police. Or I could find out who had been watching me for days. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. Then, a voice, barely above a whisper. Don't. My breath caught in my throat. That whisper, so quiet, so close, sent ice through my veins. I took a shaky step back. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, to call someone, but my body wouldn't move. The closet door stood still. The silence was unbearable. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me? Number, I knew what I heard, and whoever was in there knew. I heard it too. I forced myself to move, stepping back toward the hallway, never taking my eyes off the closet. My fingers fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my breathing too loud in the dead silence of the house. 911. I barely heard the first ring over the pounding in my chest. Then, a voice. 911. What's your emergency? I opened my mouth to answer, But before I could speak, the closet door burst open. I didn't see a face, just movement. A blur of dark clothing. A man. He shoved past me so fast that I stumbled back, almost dropping my phone. I heard his footsteps pounding down the hallway, then the sharp slam of the back door flying open. He was running. I gasped for air, spinning toward the sound. By the time I reached the back door, he was already gone. I stood there, shaking, staring into the darkness outside. The night was still, silent, as if nothing had just happened, but someone had been inside my house watching me, and I had no idea for how long. The police arrived within minutes. I barely remember what I told them. I was still in shock, my hands shaking too hard to hold my phone properly. I explained about the wet footprints, about the closet door, about the whisper, about how I had seen a man standing on the street for nights before my parents left. An officer checked the backyard, shining a flashlight over the grass, but the man was gone. There were muddy footprints outside leading from the back door, but they ended a few houses down, vanishing into the street. Like he had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. The police searched the house, checked the locks, reassured me that everything seemed safe now. But I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I didn't sleep that night. Even after the police left, even after I triple-checked every lock in the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the fact that a stranger had been inside my closet. It wasn't just the fact that he had been watching me for days. It was the fact that I never heard him come in. I kept running over it in my head. The back door had been locked when I went to sleep. The windows were shut. There was no sign of a break-in. So how had he gotten inside? The next morning I did something I'd never done before. I searched my own house. I checked everything, every lock, every window, every possible way someone could have gotten in. And then, in the hallway near the laundry room, I saw it. A tiny square in the ceiling. The attic entrance, my stomach dropped. The attic, I'd never paid much attention to it before. We never really used it. Just a small space above the house for insulation and old Christmas decorations. But now, staring up at it, a terrible thought formed in my mind. I grabbed the stepladder from the closet. My hands were sweating as I set it up, the cheap metal wobbling slightly under my weight as I climbed up. I reached for the latch, hesitated, and then pushed it open. The wooden panel slid back with a soft scrape. A wave of dust drifted down, making me cough. I lifted my phone, turning on the flashlight, and that's when I saw it. A sleeping bag, a half-empty water bottle, and next to it, oh, a crumpled candy wrapper, my candy. From my kitchen, I nearly fell off the ladder. Someone had been living in my attic. I scrambled down, heart pounding, backing away like the opening in the ceiling might swallow me whole. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight. The man hadn't just broken in last night. He had been here for days, watching, waiting. And the worst part? I still didn't know who he was, or if he was coming back. My hands were shaking as I called the police again. This time, they took it seriously. When the officers arrived, I barely got the words out. The attic. There's something up there. He was living here. They exchanged a look before grabbing a flashlight and pulling themselves up into the crawl space. I stood at the bottom of the ladder, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for them to confirm what I already knew. And then, Jesus Christ. One of the officers swore under his breath. I heard the soft rustling of plastic, the scrape of something shifting in the dust. Then, an officer's voice. Kid. He wasn't just living up here. He climbed back down, holding something in his gloved hand, a notebook. My stomach twisted. The officer flipped through it, his expression darkening. I couldn't see the pages, but I could see his face, his frown, the way his grip on the book tightened. Finally, he looked at me. He was keeping notes on you. The police searched the attic thoroughly after that. They found more things. Empty food wrappers, bottles of water taken from my own fridge, a pile of blankets that smelled like sweat and dust. And the worst part, the handwriting in the notebook. Pages filled with times, dates, notes about my routine. when I went to sleep, when I left for school, when I was alone. One sentence stood out, written near the bottom of a page from last week. Parents leaving Friday, house empty, perfect time. They never caught him. That's the part that still keeps me up at night. The police said he probably slipped out during the first search, vanishing into the neighborhood before they could track him. They promised to patrol the area, but deep down, I knew it didn't matter, because he was already gone. And whoever he was, he had been watching me for weeks, maybe months, maybe longer. I never spent another night alone in that house. When my parents got home, I told them everything. My mom cried. My dad looked like he wanted to break something. We moved 3 months later, new city, new house, no attic. But even now, years later, I still find myself double-checking locks. Still feeling like someone is watching when I walk home alone. Because the scariest part? He could be anywhere,